Welcome back to Heck with Vulnerability, where we say in regards to the digital world, vulnerability is not a good thing. Save it for the magic of being human. Today, I'll be talking about the 2020 Rogues Gallery of some of the worst vulnerabilities reported in 2020. But take that with a grain of salt, okay? Because on that note, there were 18,358 vulnerabilities disclosed just in 2020. Worst vulnerabilities or horrific examples? With these 10, take your pick. Once each year closes, it can be nice to take a step back and at the end of 2020, as if a viral pandemic wasn't bad enough, we had to deal with digital weaknesses that left us open to more human attacks against our digital infrastructure. One of the things I'd like to point out about vulnerability is that the current vulnerabilities reported for a current year may or may not be the ones that the majority of attacks are actually using to actively exploit targets for that year. What I intend to present to you here, in no particular order of infamy, are some of the worst vulnerabilities reported in 2020. Then after I do that, I'll show you that the grand majority of top vulnerabilities reported by the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency that were used by attackers for exploit in 2020 were not reported in 2020, but earlier, which proves that the longer organizations take to patch, the longer the vulnerability will be useful to attackers, thereby increasing the general global attack surface. CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. CVE numbers are assigned by a CVE numbering authority, or CNA. MITRE is the primary CNA now. The names of each vulnerability follow a naming convention of the CVE dash year reported dash and then some arbitrary digits. CVE 2020-0022, Android Bluetooth BlueFrag. I put this one on the list because there are so many people that have Android devices. An attack against this Android vulnerability requires Bluetooth to be enabled and to obtain the MAC address of the device. The attacker can then execute commands that run with the privileges of the Bluetooth daemon. This vulnerability makes the Android device a vector for malware and allows attackers to steal potentially sensitive and confidential data from your personal device. Android 8 Oreo and Android 9 Pie are vulnerable in devices that use this OS. So it's not just phones, it's also tablets or IoT. Android 10 is vulnerable only in that a BlueFrag attack can cause a denial of service against the device's availability rather than an attack against confidentiality and integrity. But the latest stable release of Android at the time of this recording is 11 and no longer vulnerable to BlueFrag. Have you updated? Patches and updates did solve this. Patches released on February 1st, 2020, and then also February 5th, 2020 are remediated. General best advice is to prohibit your Android from being discovered via Bluetooth. It's also recommended to keep Bluetooth off unless it's required for something specific. Android OS is Linux-based, and a portion of it is open source. Proof of concept code is available on GitHub from multiple sources for this BlueFrag attack. CVE 2020-15505, MobileIron, remote code execution and authentication bypass. MobileIron is an enterprise mobility management product. These CVEs related to the remote code execution and authentication bypass were reported in July 2020. Earlier in June, Ivanti issued a patch for these. Then in December 2020, Ivanti purchased MobileIron for $872 million. Ivanti was formed from a merger in 2017 between Landesk and Heat, both leaders in the IT ops stack. This year, in 2021, Ivanti enjoyed its second consecutive year being named a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for IT service management tools. Patches were issued on June 15th, 2020, and proof of concept code is available. This vulnerability and those vulnerabilities associated are an attractive target for nation-state attackers, according to United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center. When unpatched, and if these vulnerabilities are still present in your organization, a remote attacker, if successful, could potentially bypass authentication mechanisms and execute arbitrary code via what are disclosed as unspecified vectors. CVE 2020-5722, HTTP Grandstream UCM 6200 SQL injection. Grandstream UCM 6200 series is an IP PBX appliance combining voice, video, data, and mobility features. So upon the successful exploit of this vulnerability, a threat actor can gain the same privileges as the running web service. Then with those privileges, they can create new accounts with full user rights, install programs, as well as view, change, and delete data. Vulnerable versions of the Grandstream UCM 6200 series is for version 1.0.20.16, and a firmware update does exist. 10.0.20.17 or newer are not vulnerable to the Grandstream SQL injection attack. CVE 2020-0787, Windows Bits PrivSec. For this CVE, I won't talk about who Microsoft is because the world knows. The Windows Bits PrivSec vulnerability is a weakness in how the Windows Background Intelligent Transfer Service, or BITS, handles symbolic links. Symbolic links are file system objects that point toward another file or folder and are commonly used in cloud-based file storage like OneDrive and Dropbox. The symbolic link is a shortcut, and conceptually, it's similar to a pointer to a resource, and they're used to facilitate access for files and folders on different devices or file systems. The Windows Bits is the Windows Background Intelligent Transfer Service that runs as part of the Windows operating system. Bits is often used in the process of updating Windows, System Center Configuration Manager, Windows Server Update Services, or WSIS, Security Essentials and Defender, and handles transferring files using idle network bandwidth, and also supports the file transfer between peer computers that are same domain joined. The Background Intelligent Transfer Service is also exposed through COM, or the component object model used for inter-process communication. Once the BITS vulnerability is exploited, an attacker can overwrite a targeted file and elevate their privileges, thereby logging into the system. There is a patch for this that addresses the defect in how BITS handles symbolic links. The systems affected were some versions of Windows Workstation 7 to 10 and some versions of Windows Server 2008 to 2016. You can see the full list from a link I will post in the description. There was no exploit DB entry for this, but proof of concept code does exist on GitHub. There was no exploit DB entry for this one, but proof of concept code does exist on GitHub. CVE 2020-1472, Microsoft Zerologon, NETLOGON protocol remote attack. This allows an attacker to bypass authentication within a domain environment and is caused by a flaw in NETLOGON remote protocol, which is also referred to MS-NRPC, thereby enabling the host to impersonate a domain-joined computer, even potentially impersonating something as important as a domain controller. MS-NRPC allows users and computers to authenticate to a domain-joined computer, but it doesn't just impact Windows OS. This can have implications to organizations running Samba on Unix, Linux-based systems. Samba is open source and implements the SMB Server Message Block, or CIFS, Common Internet File System Protocol. This protocol functionally allows for shared access to files, printers, and serial ports, or COM. Samba is usually implemented in blended network environments in situations where there are Linux and Windows hosts and printers, so that these hosts running different operating systems can exchange information like files and printers so that they can access the same resources. Samba can be a domain member or be set up as a domain controller. Some Samba domain controllers are vulnerable, but according to Red Hat's site, this flaw can be mitigated by using server schannel equals yes in the smb.conf configuration file. Check for specific guidance related to this vulnerability from Microsoft and your OS vendor in question. Microsoft has released an August 2020 update, but more remediation steps are needed. I will link to their KB article in this description. Secura has released a publicly available proof of concept for this vulnerability. CVE 2020-5902, F5 Big IP remote code execution. The reason why the vulnerability in the F5 Big IP family of devices is so serious is because these are network infrastructure devices that not only load balance, but manage network traffic and network security by providing authentication brokerage via MFA, and also provide app security to defend against even automated attacks against APIs exposed as web services and as well as web apps. The modules on the F5 that run on top of the Big IP traffic management operating system software, or what F5 calls the TMOS, are the DNS Global Traffic Manager, Local Traffic Manager, that you'll hear them refer to as the LTM, Advanced Firewall Manager, that they refer to as the AFM, Advanced Web Application Firewall, or the AWAF, Access Policy, Access Policy Manager, or the APM, the Secure Web Gateway, the SSL Orchestrator, and BigIQ for centralized management. And according to F5, if you were late to patch, there is a strong likelihood that you were compromised. Because of this vulnerability, unauthenticated threat actors would be able to craft malicious payloads through a web service call and fully compromise the device. According to the CISA alert, an attacker exploiting CVE 2020-5902 can take control of an organization's system, execute arbitrary system commands, create or delete files, disable services, and or execute Java code. Exploits have been posted that prove that data exfiltration and executing commands on vulnerable devices is easily within possibility. Also, a Metasploit payload exists for this. It is also important to state that if an organization patches after they were compromised, then the likelihood of still being compromised is almost certain. Remember, patching helps remediate a vulnerability, but after a threat actor has compromised your environment, it is almost certain that after patching, you are still compromised. The only thing that has changed after patching is the fact that the vulnerability isn't there for other attackers to exploit. Theoretically, the original attacker has likely gained a foothold into your environment, and a well-orchestrated incident response is necessary to detect indicators of compromise and shut down the attacker's access. This vulnerability was disclosed on June 30th, 2020, and affects the Traffic Management User Interface, or TMU. They also released a patch to address this vulnerability, but organizations are advised to assume compromise and search for indicators of compromise. Along with the patch, F5 did release information on how to search for indicators of compromise and additional guidance on secure configuration best practices. There was so much urgency around addressing this vulnerability due to the wide-reaching impact to organizations and government agencies that the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency not only created a SNORT signature so that organizations could implement it within their IDS and IPS tools to detect malicious activity related to the compromise of this vulnerability, but they also released advisories to provide a full range of support for organizations who are actively in incident response mode. These advisories I will list here, and I'll also have them down below in the description. Threat actor exploitation of F5 Big IP, guidance for F5 Big IP traffic management fact sheet, and a vulnerability in F5 Big IP could allow for remote code execution. F5 also released the CVE 2020-5902 IOC detection tool on their F5 Dev Central GitHub page. As well, they have also incorporated checking for indicators of compromise via their iHealth diagnostics tool. Currently, the nations with the largest use of F5 Big IP are the United States and China. A vulnerability like this shows how private tech companies can impact even our own national security. When I ran my facet analysis using Shodan, we can see more than a year later, there are 102 F5 Big IP devices that are verified as vulnerable, even still to this CVE 2020-5902, CVE 2020-0610, Windows RD Gateway Remote Code Execution. Windows Remote Desktop Gateway is a feature in Windows servers that can be configured and enabled in order to facilitate connections from anywhere back into the on-prem LAN environment or cloud-hosted environment. Microsoft has developed this component as an alternative to its Microsoft VDI solution. Windows Remote Desktop Gateway is more limited, but it is also less expensive. Windows Remote Desktop Gateway allows users to connect from anywhere and then use the OS and/or apps delivered by the server and essentially proxies the RDP request to the correct host. This vulnerability does not require authentication and requires no user interaction in order for the attacker to succeed. This flaw is due to how the remote desktop gateway handles connection requests. The vulnerability impacts Windows Server 2012, 2016, and 2019. In January 2020, Microsoft released a patch. In January 2021, a year later, the FBI Cyber Division released an industry notification via the Internet Crime Complaint Center, or IC3, that attackers exploiting this vulnerability had launched widespread egregor ransomware attacks since September 2020. Some proof of concept code for this vulnerability does exist. According to a Security Week article, security researchers released a denial of service attack proof of concept, and also released a scanner to test for the vulnerability, but there's no public exploit code for the remote code execution. CVE 2020-0688, Microsoft Exchange remote code execution due to static key flaw. Microsoft Exchange runs on Windows Server and is a mail and calendar host that integrates with Active Directory. The remote code execution due to static key flaw vulnerability was announced February 11th, 2020. Depending on how the system was implemented and configured, this vulnerability could allow a threat actor to compromise not only all of Exchange, but also Active Directory as well. All that's required for the attack to succeed is an initial compromised account. And these days, that's fairly easy to get with a targeted phishing campaign. And a remote attacker could then execute arbitrary code on vulnerable Microsoft Exchange servers by exploiting a serialization vulnerability in the Exchange Control Panel, or ECP, webpage. Exchange servers prior to the patch had the same validation key and validation algorithm in the web.conf file, and this allows arbitrary code from an attacker to run as the system security principal because the attacker could supply the same static valid key that is trusted by vulnerable Exchange servers. The vulnerability affected Exchange Server 2010, 2013, 2016, and 2019. In that same month of February 2020, Microsoft then released security updates for the static key flaw, but also urged that in addition to applying the security updates, organizations should check for signs of compromise. And proof of concept code does exist for this. CVE 2020-12812, FortiOS two-factor authentication bypass. FortiOS is Fortinet's operating system that runs in their network product stack that serves many use cases and boasts not only unified policies, but also a single management framework across devices. It is the foundation of what Fortinet calls their Fortinet Security Fabric. The FortiOS makes the integration of networking and security across the entire infrastructure and cloud possible. On Fortinet's site, they describe many benefits of having their entire stack using one core operating system. Some of those reasons are, but aren't limited to, what they call a context-aware security posture and the correlation of data using artificial intelligence for analysis and reporting. In 2020, Fortinet was in the Gartner Magic Quadrant as a challenger in the web application firewall category. Also in 2020, Fortinet was almost neck and neck, trailing behind Palo Alto in the visionary leader category for network firewalls. This FortiOS MFA bypass vulnerability was published July 24th, 2020, and affects FortiOS version 6.4.0, version 6.2.0 through 6.2.3, and 6.0.9, specifically related to the SSL VPN. When the two-factor is used in the config user local and the authentication type is set to remote LDAP authentication, then an attacker can use a different casing when entering the username. So a different, casing, uppercase, lowercase combination when entering the username from what has actually been defined in the FortiOS as a local user, and thereby completely bypassing the MFA prompt. This was essentially a default configuration vulnerability that Fortinet has since fixed in versions 6.4.1 and later, 6.2.4 and later, and 6.0.10 and later. In April 2021, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a joint advisory that warned that advanced threat actors were actively exploiting Fortinet's vulnerabilities against not only businesses, but also government targets. In the report, they advise on a list of mitigations, as well as ways for organizations to remain vigilant against attack. And just this month, the Australian government issued a warning related to this vulnerability. Patching on time is critical for infrastructure-related devices that have public exposure, not to mention other vulnerabilities that may not have public exposure. Vulnerability patching in the proper service level objective is important in any scenario. CVE 2020-8515, Draytek Vigor Command Injection. CVE 2020-8515, the Draytek Vigor Command Injection vulnerability encapsulates two critical flaws under one CVE and was announced on February 1st, 2020. According to the Draytek advisory, these flaws are present in Draytek Vigor 300B, Quad WAN high performance load balancing router, which is now end of life, Vigor 2960 VPN gateway for enterprise, and Vigor 3900 high performance VPN gateway for enterprise. According to another article published in thehackernews.com, security researchers also called out the Vigor Switch 20P and 20G series of switches, writing that firmware versions 2.3.2 and lower were vulnerable to the same flaws. Draytek is a Taiwan-based manufacturer of network equipment like firewalls, switches, routers, VPN routers, and wireless access points. Due to poor parameter validation, this vulnerability allows remote code execution as a root account without any authentication via shell commands to the CGI bin main function.cgi URI. From there, two different attacks can be launched, both with different consequences. This is due to poor parameter validation for key path and RTIC variables that can both independently be targeted in an exploit. The attack that takes advantage of key path allows attackers to download and execute malicious scripts on the device. The attack that takes advantage of RTIC can be used to create a backdoor for future access on the device. According to a report on PortSwigger, attacks against this vulnerability had been known and communicated in late 2019, but a patch was only issued after nearly 40 days. Plenty of time for threat actors to take advantage of more vulnerable devices across the globe. And proof of concept code does exist for this. We are reminded time and again that patching after being compromised by skilled attackers is like making sure the door is locked after someone has already broken into your home. CVE 2020-0796, SMBGhost, aka CoronaBlue. SMBGhost, aka CoronaBlue, is a Windows SMB v3 client-server remote code execution vulnerability that was published March 11th, 2021, and scored the highest severity score of 10 due to its ability to worm its way onto systems without any user interaction. The vulnerability affected both Windows clients and servers that were running SMB version 3.1.1. Server message block is a protocol that allows hosts to share resources like printers and NAS server resources where files live. The protocol operates over TCP and uses a default port of 445. Let's look at the table to the side here where we can see the different versions of SMB and when they were implemented in each Windows OS. It's important to note here that SMB version 3 has end-to-end encryption, unlike versions 1 and 2, and was meant to replace the less secure SMB version 1 and 2 protocols. So we have SMB v1 over NetBIOS that was implemented in the 90s through the pre-Windows 2000. Then SMB v1 over TCP was implemented in Windows 2000. And then again in Windows Server 2003. The SMB v2 over TCP was then implemented in Windows Vista and Server 2008. And then SMB v2.1 was implemented in Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2. And then SMB v2.2, which is now called SMB v3, that has been implemented in Windows 8 and later, and Windows Server 2012 and later. So SMBGhost, or CoronaBlue as some were calling it, is a remote code execution vulnerability. If you have Windows 10, 1903, or 1909 hosts, and your hosts connect with a malicious SMB3 server that an attacker has control over, with this vulnerability, an unauthenticated attacker can execute arbitrary code on your hosts. Or if you have a vulnerable Windows server running 1903 or 1909 core installation, then an unauthenticated threat actor can craft a payload to vulnerable hosts that allows them to execute commands on your endpoints. Proof of concept does exist, and in fact, one of those proof of concepts was able to establish that this indeed was a globally wormable vulnerability on the level of WannaCry. And for this reason, CISA, the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, put out an advisory, especially asking organizations to block 445 at your firewall in addition to patching. Hosts from within your network should not be able to communicate out to the internet via port 445, and inbound traffic from the internet should not be able to communicate with your organization through 445. At the time of making this video, my Shodan facet analysis shows the top countries where organizations were exposing port 445 to the internet. When you look at numbers like these, you just think, I hope these are all honeypots. But then you know that this is probably wishful thinking. There really is no reason that an SMB service should be open to the internet for two primary reasons. One, security researchers and attackers are finding service vulnerabilities all the time. Two, 0 days also exist. A safer way to make SMB services available for remote users is through the implementation of a VPN that is protected by multi-factor authentication. Not only have patches been released for this vulnerability, but there is also additional guidance by Microsoft to disable SMB compression via running a PowerShell command. This helps protect vulnerable servers in your environment, but it will not help protect hosts or endpoints. If you are still vulnerable to any of the CVEs that I've discussed in this video, or any of the other 18,000 that were disclosed in 2020, please patch, please upgrade. It can happen to you. Now, after I've given you a tour of these vulnerabilities, I want to show you that based on government data reported by the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, in their newly revised alert as of August 2021, their newly revised alert as of that time, alert AA 21209A, the majority of top vulnerabilities that were identified as used by attackers for exploit in 2020 were not reported in 2020, but earlier. In 2020, more than 66% of the top CVEs used were reported in previous years. Only about 33% of the top CVEs targeted for attack that fell into this list were actually reported in 2020. Patching quickly and remediating ahead of the curve is still important, very important. Attackers can easily discover your weak spots. And the point is, those threat actors don't care when the CVEs were published or released. They just hope that you are late to remediate. But make no mistake, it isn't just critical and high severity CVEs that you need to worry about. Even low and medium severity vulnerabilities, when chained together, can lead to full compromise. General recommendations that are in line with protecting against these vulnerabilities are: don't leave services on if you don't need them. Make patching and upgrading a priority. Don't allow users administrative purposes just because they want it. Make sure it is a business need. Their primary login should be a standard user account and not an administrator account. Train users to understand that they are part of the security stack of your organization. The security controls that you've implemented in your organization don't have magic powers and still require users to act cautiously, with mindful deliberation and with security in mind. The best advice is to have a serious and responsive upgrade and patching program, a dedicated vulnerability management practice, incident response management, a solid implementation of defense in depth with your security stack, as well as practicing generally good cyber hygiene. And to heck with vulnerability. Until next time.